Chapter 1, The Long Night, You'll pick it up fast enough, said the older sister to the new nurse. But be aware that it's not at all like the cardio ward. The younger nurse gave a small derisive snort. The cardiothoracic surgeons all believe they're God's gift to the world. Their heads are so big, it's a wonder they can find a hat that fits. They both chuckled softly for a few seconds at the inside humor nursing staff didn't share with outsiders, especially doctors who were both allies and enemies depending on the situation. Neurology consists of small steps, and doctors rarely achieve life-changing improvements, especially with the chronic and long-term traumatic brain injury patients. We call them TBIs, the older nurse explained as they turned into a small room with a single bed. The thick folder sitting upright in the basket at the foot of the bed read Michael Bates. We call him Patient 13, she gave a small, humorless laugh. He was shot in the head. An inch to the right would have missed him completely, and an inch to the left would have killed him outright. The younger woman nodded her understanding. Either way would have been better. Keeping these patients alive in the hospital would always be a very expensive exercise and a giant drain on the family. How long? She asked. About a year. They fell silent as two people entered the room. Their voices were not raised, but there was an edge to them. Leading the way was the senior neurologist, Dr. Carlos da Silva. He had a Spanish or Portuguese heritage and was dark enough to show the Moorish influence in his genes. They all nodded, their heads in quiet acknowledgement of each other. Then the two nurses made an unobtrusive exit. Please, Mrs. Bates, you work in the pharmaceutical industry, so you're hardly someone who doesn't understand. Your husband's vegetative state is unlikely to improve. If he were brainstem dead, then as an organ donor, we could have at least harvested his organs and made a significant difference to a number of people, but he's not. He's vegetative, and we've done what we could, but we can't keep him in the hospital or keep spending time on him when we have so many other patients with better outcomes to look after. She shook her head negatively. We only have a month to go before he is declared in a permanent vegetative state, and if we don't act now, our medical provider will deny paying for further interventions, and I'll end up having to place him in a long-term care facility and watch him wither. She angrily dabbed at her eyes. He's only 46. He still has many years of life ahead of him. He looked at her for any sign that said she was just another relative grasping at straws and demanding that he bypass medicine in favor of a miracle, but she wasn't that. Clearly she had an idea in mind, and probably one that would either stretch his personal or professional ethics to the limit. He had known Mrs. Bates for almost a year, ever since her husband had been rushed in with a gunshot wound to the head. Apparently, it was the result of a botched car jacking just off North Lakeshore Drive as he was leaving a gas station. He had learned that both Mrs. and Mr. Bates worked for the Swiss biotech company BioVest, which specialized in oncology drugs, and that was the other half of the problem. She knew enough to challenge him, but not enough to realize that this was a lost cause. He tried one more time to help her reach the right decision. He may not even have that many years left in reality. We both know that sooner or later a DVT, or even a surface clot, will show up because of the inactivity, and there's a good chance it will go to his heart, lungs, or brain. He noticed her lips tighten, but he went on regardless, because it had to be said. If you sign a DNR, at least when the time comes we can harvest his organs and let his death bring life, or help to so many others. No. She met his eyes, completely unintimidated by his positional power or status. He was once again forced to re-evaluate Mrs. Bates. Her posture was upright, and her conservative work suit did very little to hide her well-toned body beneath. Coupled with that was a face that, although not classically beautiful, wouldn't look out of place as a presenter or anchor on any TV station, but it was the force of her personality that was proving both compelling and, if he dared to admit it, attractive. Zolpidem. She said to him. It wasn't just a word, it wasn't just a name, it was a number of controversial articles in medical publications around the world. Zolpidem was the generic name for a common sleeping tablet from the French pharma giant Sanofi Aventis and sold in the US under the trade name Ambien, or Stilnox in the UK, EU, Australia, and Africa. They called it the miracle drug for coma and vegetative patients. Approved as a Schedule IV short-term sleeping pill, a group of South African doctors started reporting its paradoxical effects in that they were achieving up to 60% wakefulness in coma and vegetative patients. Unfortunately, the problem was that most patients only managed to stay awake while the medication was active 3.5 to 4 hours before regressing, and obviously they still suffered from brain damage-related problems such as mobility, speech impediments, memory lapses, and so on, according to the brain damage they had suffered. And after? He quizzed her. What happens when he lapses back after the effect wears off? She didn't flinch. What if it doesn't even work? Well, then we would know that we've tried everything, she answered softly but firmly. He secretly envied their relationship. Mrs. Bates had been a thorn in his side, pushing and prodding for better outcomes. He thought about his own wife, Andrea, at home and wondered if she would be as involved, as demanding, as committed to helping him in any way and every way possible, if he was in a similar situation. Bite your tongue, he thought to himself as a wave of irrational superstition about not thinking of bad things in case they came to pass, washed over him momentarily. He forced his thoughts back to the present as she dug around in her bag and presented him with a small Ziploc clear plastic envelope like it was an illicit street drug. Coke or speed or something similar. 10 milligrams. Crushed, she grinned unashamed. We can flush it down Michael's nasogastric tube with some water. They mixed it in water and sucked it into the large needle-less syringe used to deliver liquidized food and water to the patient via his nasogastric tube and injected it into the port. Suddenly, D.A. Silva found himself desperate for a cup of coffee, but she wouldn't be moved, so he pulled up a chair next to her and helped her wait. He knew he was wasting time that he could have spent on other patients, but a sense of loyalty and an almost macabre curiosity kept him rooted next to the bed, waiting to see the outcome, if any, from its very inception. It would be his first. He stole a quick glance at Mrs. Bates. He wasn't a trained reader of body language, but he could sense the tightness of her muscles. Her mouth was set in a hard line, her eyes narrowed. She was a woman prepared for the worst outcome possible, yet hoping for more. Knowing that she was a regulatory pharmacist at BioVest, he tried unsuccessfully to engage her in industry conversation, but she answered in monosyllables and truncated sentences. Her focus was exclusively on the patient, her husband. Every few minutes she glanced at her Apple Watch as she counted up the elapsed time. 20 minutes passed and there was no discernible change in the patient. 30 dragged, in an agonizing proof that time was in fact inconsistent and variable. Finally, the moment critique arrived and still nothing. It was looking like there was no hope. They waited a little longer. The elapsed time was 37 minutes when 2 large tears ran down Mrs. Bates' eyes and she searched around her handbag for a tissue. Mandy? Chapter 2. The sleeper awakened. She jerked upright and leaped from her chair. Where am I? His voice was hoarse, his tongue uncooperative, and he had the uncomfortable need to swallow like there was something stuck in his throat. She threw herself on him, sobbing her heart out. You're awake. You're awake. What else would he be? He wondered, looking around. He found himself in a hospital room of some kind. He could hear the ECG monitor above the bed. She lifted up to look at him properly, and as he turned to follow her, became aware of something attached to his face. He discovered the nasogastric tube and irrationally tried to grab it to pull it out, but she grabbed his arm and effortlessly pushed it away. His arm looked like it wasn't his at all. It was a skinny, wasted, pasty white arm that belonged to a 90-year-old man. Alarmed, he tried to sit up even as the heart monitor started beeping loudly and his heart rate screamed upwards. Lie back, sweetheart, lie back. She urged him with concern, and momentarily defeated, he gave up the fight to sit up. Next to Mandy, Da Silva's mouth was agape in wonder. This is unbelievable, he said. Mike, do you understand me? She searched his eyes. Yes, that's a stupid question, he thought idly, but with a growing sense of tension. Why? And why was he unable to speak? It felt like his tongue wasn't his own and it felt numb, almost like he had too much Novocaine at the dentist. You've been hurt, my darling. She was crying even harder, unable to control the emotions that had swamped her. Hurt real bad. Where? His thinking was slow and nebulous, and he was becoming agitated. Get me out. I want to go home. He tried to sit up again. This is not good, said D.A. Silva as the monitors started beeping in earnest. He wished they had prepared better, but she had caught him unawares and unprepared, and he wasn't expecting this outcome. You've been vegetative for over a year, my sweetheart. He seemed to understand the words but had trouble with the concept. His sluggish brain was making his agitation worse. He tried again to get the tube out of his nose, as if that it was the chain holding him down. If he only could, he would be free to get up and go. His agitation and confusion was spiking when his vision started constricting. He moaned his distress. Then a wave hit him like a series of unrelenting electric shocks, and his body started jerking about out of control. He's having a tonic-clonic seizure, was the last thing he heard. He opened his eyes to find Mandy leaning over him. He scanned her face and realized that she looked stressed and tired with dark circles under her re-rimmed eyes. "Hi," he greeted her hoarsely. She was more in control than the last time he remembered, but he couldn't work out how long it had been. Was it a short while ago, or was it yesterday, or... "Michael, take a deep breath. I have so much to tell you, but you need to listen." He nodded, although a surge of anxiety made him feel uneasy. "You were injured in the head, Michael, and you've been unresponsive for almost a year. We gave you a medication called Zolpidem, which wakes you up temporarily. Do you understand?" His mind slowly made the connection, and tears welled up in his eyes. It felt like the end of his life, knowing that he would only be awake for a limited time before the drug wore off and he would be back in his unconscious state. A sob escaped him, filled with despair. "Michael. Michael. I need you to focus. It's important." She urged him to snap out of his despair and pay attention. "Your brain injury is on the left side, affecting your frontal and occipital lobe. We won't know the extent of the damage until the doctors run cognitive tests." He nodded, realizing the implications based on his knowledge of anatomy. "I understand." His slurred words struggled to escape his mouth. "You're also experiencing seizures called tonic-clonic seizures." Again, he nodded, finding it easier than speaking. "In the past, they used to be called grand mal seizures. These seizures begin on the injured side of your brain and then spread to both hemispheres." "Doctor D.A. Silva prescribed you lamotrigine." He nodded once more, recognizing it as a good anti-epileptic medication that also had a mood-stabilizing effect. He looked around the room but realized she was the only one there. "It's just me today, so I can talk to you without causing any distress. But starting tomorrow, the doctors will want to run tests and examine you. Do you understand?" He sadly nodded, accepting what awaited him. Reaching out, he weakly touched her with his trembling arm. "I'm sorry," he slurred. "You don't deserve this." His words were even more slurred, but she shook her head and wiped away their tears. "We have about 3 to 4 hours, Michael. I need you to start using your brilliant mind. If the roles were reversed, if it was me, what would you do?" He furrowed his brow, deep in thought, trying to navigate through the muddy mess of his brain. He didn't want to think about it. He wanted to hold Mandy and feel her presence, but it wasn't possible. After a moment, his frown disappeared as he forgot the question. "Focus, Michael, focus." She urged him. He struggled to bring his thoughts back to her question. "What would you do?" she repeated, hoping to reawaken his mind. He thought for a while, but found himself drifting off into thoughts of unfairness. Then he wanted to pretend it wasn't happening, but deep down he knew he had to take control and make something happen. Mandy urged him to focus again. He wrestled with his thoughts and managed to piece together ideas. At first, they were jumbled and didn't make sense, but eventually, words and concepts illuminated like bright lights, and he verbalized them. His speech was slurred, but this is what she heard: psilocybin. He paused, and she encouraged him to continue. "Take the maximum dose of psilocybin, 2 doses each week for a month." She understood, recognizing psilocybin as a psychedelic mushroom that had shown potential in promoting the growth of new brain connections. "Drink plenty of water to stay hydrated and flush out toxins." His speech was slow and interrupted, but she comprehended his words and repeated them back to make sure they matched. In between, she comforted him with touches and gentle rubs, all the while reminding him of the question he had to answer. "Methylphenidate, not Ritalin, because it has a longer-lasting effect. Let's see if it keeps me awake after the Zolpidem wears off." His speech was slurred, but she understood his intention. He stopped and thought for a while. She worried that he had slipped back into his vegetative state, but he was slowly exploring his mind, searching for answers like a person navigating a new building. But not together. Start with the mushrooms. His speech became even more difficult to understand as exhaustion overcame him. She persisted in asking him to repeat, even though he would forget the previous question or answer within minutes. She realized that he was proposing a way to live that was better than the alternative. Putting aside her emotions, she viewed him objectively as a clinician. He was still awake, although lost in his mind, trying to navigate the missing pieces of his reality. However, there was enough of his brilliant mind left to make every effort worth it. In the following days, she sat with him and updated him on everyday events. His concerns spiked when he realized it was 2017 and that he had lost 3 years' worth of memories during his 11-month unconsciousness. Michael struggled to piece together the missing time, only to realize that it was impossible to search for something you didn't even know existed. He asked Mandy about major events, birthdays, vacations, and holidays, trying to glean any clues. He laughed when he discovered that Trump was president. He also had no idea that their 22-year-old son was working for Cape Airlines in the Caribbean. He remembered Jason attempting to get his twin-engine rating, but that was the last thing he knew. Mandy showed him pictures on her phone, providing visual evidence of Jason's visits. Their discussion sparked his mind and slowly improved his memory. However, every time the zolpidem-induced wakefulness wore off, he slipped back into his vegetative state. Within days of his initial wakefulness, Dr. Carlos da Silva had assembled a team of neurologists who were excited about the potential breakthrough. They saw themselves publishing their findings in renowned medical journals. The Hospital Ethics Committee greenlit the off-label use of zolpidem and methylphenidate, and the team aimed to redefine treatment protocols for coma and vegetative states, using Michael as their first test subject in the USA. When Mandy insisted on the addition of psilocybin, a heated disagreement erupted between her and Dr. da Silva. However, the rest of the young neurologists, in their late 20s and early 30s, saw the potential of magic mushrooms. Together, they approached the ethics committee once again, and reluctantly, psilocybin was approved. Michael received the first dose orally, with Mandy by his side, holding his hand as the psychedelic journey began. Colors shifted and intensified, while memories long forgotten resurfaced, accompanied by a range of emotions. He experienced the trip until both the trip and his wakefulness waned, and he returned to his vegetative state. The next day, cognitive and memory tests began, and he slowly improved his mental capacity. An hour of physiotherapy each day allowed him to sit up in bed for short periods. His speech remained slurred, especially when he grew tired, but he managed to stay awake for 5 hours. Michael suggested they celebrate with champagne, but Mandy laughed, reminding him that he couldn't afford to lose any more brain cells. However, she promised to have a glass later that evening, toasting on his behalf. The month after the psilocybin, methylphenidate was added to the zolpidem, and he made 6 hours awake. Then the 6 became 6.5 and finally 7, and it felt like he was living life again, albeit with really long down times. He worked with a psychologist and speech therapist named Karina Anderson, and Da Silva said she was considered something of a prodigy, and that she had asked to work on his case. She challenged him with physical and mental exercises, and in a short period Mandy remarked that she thought that some of his brain fog was lifting, but it was sadly obvious even to her that Michael wasn't as sharp as he had been before. Bruno Rossi, who was the detective on his case, came round to interview him. He said that the bullet fired at him had hit the doorframe, splitting in two. The smaller piece had entered his head. It was .380 caliber weapon. It was lucky for him it wasn't a 9mm or a .45 round, otherwise he wouldn't be here. Unfortunately, both the local and the national database had no match to that bullet, so no help there. Nor was Michael of much help, as he had no memory of the event. When his physiotherapy had progressed enough for him to stand, he was introduced to Darius Green, ex-Army. He was to become his daily trainer for the next 6 months. Darius was tough and made it a point of projecting a persona and attitude he thought would suit the patient. "Michael, can I call you Michael?" he continued without waiting for a response. "I don't care, Michael. You need to understand that and believe it. I don't care how you feel. I only care about results." He looked down on him like he was a sergeant on the parade ground and Michael was a boot camp grunt. "I have a lot of patience, and you're just one in a list of many." Another unrelenting stare. "You will push yourself harder than you thought possible, and when you get there, I will push you to go even further." He sat back with an air of finality. "I don't work with quitters. If you don't like it, ask for someone else." His tough approach frightened, but also challenged Michael, who responded with, "I'll see you on the road for a half marathon in 6 months." And Darius burst into laughter. Some 6 weeks later, the combination of drugs were keeping him awake between 6 to 8 hours when Mandy arrived with the North American CEO and long-term colleague and friend Robert Neumann. "Glad to see you alive and getting better, Michael." His voice filled the small room like warm honey. "Your job is still open and your team have done a great job on the hexylamine dossier, and we're now only months away from submission." The BioVest scientific team had been working on the clinical trials for hexylamine for some time, all double-blind and randomized to prove efficacy and safety in humans vs. the current treatment protocols, and it was looking good. Mandy's done an excellent job of compiling the dossier and preparing it for submission. He dropped his hand onto Mandy's shoulder gently before running it down her back, making her shiver. Michael's eyes widened and she noticed. She looked at Robert, and with a hiss she swept his hand off her back. He ignored her action with practiced ease and placed his hand back on her shoulder, patting it. "Stop that." She slapped it away. Chapter 3:1, Reclaiming the Day. Come on, Michael. Give me 3 more. 2. 1. Well done. Keep hydrated, we're done for the day. Darius ran a quick visual assessment of his patient. Michael was 5'11", 131 pounds. BMI of 16. That was underweight, but rebuilding muscle was a long, drawn-out, and painful process. The patient had, however, shown an uncommon will to succeed, and that was rare, he thought, especially in civilians. For Michael, the positives were that he was now able to stay awake for about 8 to 10 hours, but when he got tired, he crashed. He was partially deaf in his left ear and was fitted with one of the new, almost invisible hearing aids. His right leg dragged and walking still required concentration, as his sense of balance was somewhat shot. Get it, hey, he laughed at his own joke. His memory of the last 3 years or so was gone and unlikely to return, but on the positive side, his speech therapist said he would probably sound almost normal in a year or so as he got his tongue under better control. For the time being, however, he had a definite lisp and occasionally went into a stutter as his brain and tongue disconnected. He had also lost some of his sense of smell and taste, which led to a loss of appetite, and he had to force himself to eat at times. The one constant in his life outside of the medical staff was Mandy. She visited him daily before and after work. On the weekends, she aligned his waking time with her visits to maximize their time together. She spent time consulting initially with DA Silva and after a while predominantly with Karina, as the two of them navigated Michael's sometimes volatile emotional shifts and changes. His long, drawn-out recuperation meant that Jason grabbed leave to come visit, and it was both soulful and heartwarming for father and son to spend time together and enabled them to talk of the future. A future that a short while before was lost. It also gave friends and colleagues many opportunities to visit him. Initially, Michael exhibited an almost childlike excitement in seeing them, but then as his thinking coalesced and he became more self-aware, he started dreading the visits, as they simply demonstrated that he had lost the ability to delve deep or jump from topic to topic, subject to subject with the alacrity and ease they displayed. He felt stupid and slow and beneath them. It led to depression, but just when it seemed that his rehab had gone as far as it could, he hit a milestone that was unexpected and shocking to the medical team. It was early morning when DA Silva walked into the patient's room on his early rounds, only to find the bed empty. Looking around in confusion, he saw Michael coming out of the bathroom. "How? When did you get up?" he asked. "Now, I needed to pee." DA Silva crashed down on the chair next to the bed. "But we haven't given you your daily dose of Zolpidem." He rubbed his eyes and looked at Michael in wonder. "You woke up on your own." This is unbelievable. He thought about it for a second. In fact, it's unthinkable. And so it came to pass that Michael Bates, here and forever after, known to the medical staff as Lazarus, was the first vegetative patient on Zolpidem to have eventually woken up on his own accord without further use of the drug. The simple explanation was that his brain had somehow reset itself. Not to what it had been before the trauma, but better than anyone could have hoped or believed possible. The clinical study that was submitted and published in the name caused a small academic uproar in terms of the drug treatment used, but especially the use of psilocybin. It also attracted many detractors who claimed that the patient's vegetative state had been misdiagnosed. Others stated that considering the clinical results, he would have achieved wakefulness eventually with or without intervention, but regardless of the differing opinions, the treatment regimen was now published, and the medical team became sought after in local and international conferences and symposia, where they presented the case to a rapidly growing group of interested followers. By then, Michael's in-hospital recovery was over. His drug regimen had been reduced to lifelong lamotrigine to stop the epileptic fits, and SSRI to control a mild bipolar condition known as cyclothymia that had developed or had become exacerbated due to the injury, and long-term Concerta to keep his mind active and focused. By then, he was able to stay awake for about 12 to 14 hours a day, but invariably became mentally fatigued quickly and needed a 2-hour afternoon nap if he was to make it past 7 in the evening. He considered himself to be a mess, but at least he was going home. Jason called and wished him well and apologized for not being there at that time, but the airline was short of pilots, rated for the aircraft they flew, so he was busy nonstop within the regulated hours. When Mandy took Michael home, he was like a small boy bubbling with excitement. He explored the house, then the garden. He looked at photographs of their life together. When she called him for a light lunch, he thanked her repeatedly for all she had done for him. She smiled through the tears in her eyes, and that set Michael off as well, and they cried holding each other like survivors of a sinking ship floating in uncharted waters. Despite their happiness and connection to each other, Mandy was secretly concerned about the future. Her husband was alive, brought back from the dead by an act of complete desperation from her, and thereafter, despite the brain damage he had suffered, he had essentially become the architect of his own return to a new normality. But she acknowledged to herself that it was hardly the normal she remembered. Gone was the man with the surefire wit and the ability to captivate a whole room with his brilliance. Also gone was his incredible self-belief that often bordered on arrogance. In its place, Michael's sense of love and loyalty for her had evolved or devolved, according to the private thoughts of Karina Anderson, into something akin to a religious devotion. It was as if she was his guardian angel who had brought him back from the dead through her divine intervention. It manifested in his need to do everything for her. Every morning he made her breakfast and prepared her a home-packed lunch before she left for work. It was almost like he was presenting her with a ritualized offering every day. When she came home, he rubbed her back, shoulders, and on a few occasions even gave her a foot massage, something he had never done before. Sometimes she would return from work to find him sitting contentedly on the wooden bench on their front porch waiting for her to come home. It gladdened and saddened her simultaneously and kept her worried about his long-term prospects. The only part she wasn't worried about at present was their financial future, because BioVest had injury and disability insurance that had paid out close to $500,000, over and above paying all medical and rehabilitation costs not covered by their health provider. In the evenings, they invariably cooked together. He'd have the radio on, and together they cut, chopped, peeled, trimmed, spiced, rubbed, prepared, roasted, fried, grilled, boiled, and did everything that constitutes cooking. Usually Mandy would have a glass of juice in her hand, while he had a soda, as it was a long dry season for him as per doctor's orders. He currently slept alone in the guest room because his sleep was punctuated with violent jerks, kicks, spasms, and thrashings, making it dangerous to be his bedmate. The spare room was set up with an oxygen bottle, ECG machine, oxygen saturation monitor, all connected to an alarm, in case he somehow lapsed back into a catatonic state. "Dance with me." He urged her and held her close while they made small, slow circles around the kitchen to a soothing song playing on the radio. The smell of dinner in the oven mingled with the leftover smell of her perfume and a hint of her natural scent, teasing his nose and his senses. Karina and Carlos, by now, they were all on first-name terms, both counseled patience. "It's too soon to start changing your medication, Michael. I want to feel like my old self for Mandy. For myself. I can't go on feeling like this any longer. It's too soon, Michael. Let's give it another 3 months and reevaluate then." They tried to reassure him, but in reality he had already made up his mind. So the next day he stopped taking the medication, deciding to rather live with a mild mood disorder, which was preferable to his lack of enthusiasm and passion. He didn't notice any change over the first 4 days, but on the 5th he awoke aware that he had been dreaming. He tried to remember the dream. Unknown figures had chased him down a busy street. People stopped and stared, but no one intervened. Suddenly it was Mandy who caught up with him. "Go back, Mike." And she turned and walked away together with a shadowy figure that reminded him of Robert, while he discovered that he was standing in the middle of the street. It left him shaken for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was the first time he remembered having a dream since his awakening. Secondly, he was aware that there was something trying to surface, running circles just beneath his consciousness, frustrating his efforts to bring it to the surface. Having quit the medication, altered his sleep patterns, and he woke up that night realizing that Mandy had come into his bedroom to check on him. He was elated that he had woken up another first. He was about to call out to her, but she had already turned to leave the room while talking on her phone, and something in her voice made him hold back. "That was then, this is now. Well, I do miss it. I miss you too, but I can't. Because Michael needs me, that's why. I can't. I won't. Not now. Well, yes, it's been a long time. Don't ask me that." She gave a small sob. "No, Michael needs me. Yes, I remember." She was becoming irritated. "It hasn't been easy for me either." By then she had moved to the main bedroom's ensuite bathroom, and he couldn't hear her anymore, but he had heard enough to trigger a suppressed memory from the first days of waking from his vegetative state, when Robert came to visit. He had put his hand on Mandy's back and ran it down her spine. She had brushed it off, but not because it was unwelcome or even unexpected, but because she was embarrassed by his behavior in front of her husband. He lay in bed awake for some time before sleep overtook him once more. "You're looking deep in thought this morning," she said. "As they sat down to breakfast, I have a lot to think about." He replied non-committally. "Is it about the half marathon this weekend?" Her eyes sparkled, and it made him want to lash out at her. How was she able to act so differently? Or was she? Was he simply paranoid? Was it his damaged brain unable to process what he had heard correctly? He managed to suppress the urge to blurt something out as he realized that first he needed to take control of his life before any confrontations. "I promised Darius I'd give him a run for his money this weekend, and I only hope I can finish never mind keep up with him." He turned away and walked up the stairs in his peculiar climbing gait necessitated by his lazy foot. She finished her juice deep in thought and left for work with a sense of foreboding. Her instincts warned her that he was distant and that the love, no, not just love, the almost worship that he had shown her over the past months hadn't simply vanished. It seemed that it had completely disappeared overnight. She wondered what could have caused it and remembered her phone conversation the night before. Could he have heard her? It seemed unlikely as it had been late, past his waking hours. But still. Inside the house, Michael was on a mission. He went through the home laptop, nothing. Home landline, also nothing. He went to what used to be their bedroom, nothing. He went through her walk-in wardrobe and initially found nothing there either. But going through her drawers brought about some unsettling discoveries. He spotted her well-used document bag, often referred to as a pilot's bag, and looked inside. It was mostly empty except for some inconsequential sheets of paper, some irrelevant office correspondence, and an empty manila envelope with her name on it from a lawyer. He opened it on a whim. Stuck to the inside almost unseen was a torn piece of printed paper that read "Dissolution of Marriage." The rest was missing. His head was spinning, and he backed against the wall and slid down, almost paralyzed by the numbing sensation washing over him like a wave. His whole body felt weak, unable to support his weight, and yet his muscles felt inflamed and he wanted to hurt something or someone. That someone had a name. She was called Mandy. But he also knew that he couldn't confront her. At least not yet. He wondered whether he should call Jason, but after some consideration, even his somewhat obtuse thinking suggested that it would either place Jason in a situation where he would be forced to lie or take sides in what would quickly become a zero-sum game with no winners. He figured it out slowly in the end and decided to go it alone. So there it was. A secret lurking just beneath the surface like an iceberg, and the next few days were spent in an uneasy peace like the beginnings of a cold war or the quiet before the storm. Mandy, unsure of his frame of mind, tried her best to get him to open up on what was bothering him, hoping against hope that it was something small and manageable, but he deflected her attempts. She was astute and familiar enough with his new persona by now to realize that his anger and resentment was aimed at her. She considered her options: ignore, confront, deflect. This was going to be tricky, but before she had a chance to decide on a course of action, Darius was there to pick up Michael, and they left for the Maggie Dally Park to collect their entry numbers for the next day. Later, he called to inform her that he and Darius and he would be eating a lot of pasta at an Italian restaurant. She made herself a sandwich and tried unsuccessfully to watch some TV. They were back at 7:30 and Darius came in for a short while to say hello. Then he and Michael made final arrangements for the next day. By the time Darius was off, Michael was already heading for bed. He pointedly closed his bedroom door, and she went to bed with an icy hand clutching her heart. She thought of herself as an intelligent and rational woman, but on an emotive level, having to consider that she could lose Michael was more than she could bear. Not now, not after all they had been through just to get here. She sniffed unshed tears as she, though especially not now when she had this new Michael who was in fact reminiscent of their early days and so much more lovable than the Michael before his injury. Sunday she was up before him and prepared a high-carb breakfast and a fruit smoothie. "I'll take you to the race. I'd like to be there for you at the end," she suggested, but his mouth tightened into a hard line. "I've already made arrangements with Darius." He didn't even bother to look at her. She could feel him slipping away, but she had decided that it wouldn't be without a fight. Breakfast over, with very few words shared, Michael went outside and started a slow, low-impact warm-up while he waited for Darius. From his point of view, watching Mandy's behavior had confirmed his initial verdict of guilty, the certainty of which had now coalesced into a cold, hard wall, marking the end of their marriage. "I'll be waiting for you at the finish line," she shouted as he pulled off with Darius, and she went to get herself ready. "What's going on, man?" queried Darius, having noticed the change dynamic. "Do I have to talk about it?" He huddled into himself. You do if you want me to push you across the finish line. Michael considered for a long moment. Other than his deceased parents and Mandy, possibly even more than Mandy, Darius had seen him at his very worst moments. The moments when he had cried and railed at the world, his useless body, and the unfairness of it all. He had witnessed his stumbles, his falls, and the moments of jubilation when he had exceeded his own expectations. Darius knew him. He knew him well. Mandy is cheating or has cheated on me, he announced, forlornly unable to meet the other's eyes. You sure? Michael nodded affirmatively. During your unconscious state? I don't know. Maybe. Michael shrugged again, bitter at his lack of knowledge of the why, when, and what. But he was pretty sure he knew the who. Man, that's cold. In the Army, we called that getting jodied. He glanced over at Michael, who sat hunched over in his misery. Is there any hope for a reconciliation? He added as an afterthought. Michael looked blindly out the window in a funk. Having spoken about Mandy's betrayal had made it so much worse, like it had solidified and become tangible, real. Unlikely. Then, on second thought, don't see how that would be possible. She saved you, Mike. Darius wasn't a doctor, but he understood enough of what had happened. Hell, everybody had spoken about nothing but, and we're still talking about it. Maybe she should have just let me be. Michael was starting to wallow in self-pity. It wasn't a pretty sight, and nor was it good for him. Come on, Mike, you don't mean that. They drove on in silence. At the start of the race, Michael was vacillating between anger and depression, and having stopped taking the SSRIs wasn't helping either. When the gun went, he grabbed onto the anger and forced it to sustain his focus. Darius ran alongside, pacing him. They had agreed to try run at 9-minute miles for a sub-2-hour finish. The first 5 miles were relatively easy, as he had run the distance in training. From 5 to 8, he had to focus on his cadence, lifting his knees high in order to stop his lazy foot from dragging and tripping him over. He watched the hundreds of runners who passed him doing little more than a fast shuffle, and he envied them. He soldiered on, much to Darius' quiet admiration. But the final 5 miles turned into a struggle, made both better and worse by Darius, who encouraged, urged, and at times demanded focus and pace. With 3 miles to go, Michael found himself in a self-generated bubble of pain in a body that was begging him to stop. Instead, he gathered whatever resolve he had left and, looking at the spectators lining the street, ran from one face to the next, imagining that each one was there only for him, and he ran so he wouldn't disappoint them or let them down. Straighten up. Head high now. Show no pain. They reached the park with the finish line in sight. Darius stayed on his weak side, talking him through the final yards as a surge of late adrenaline pushed him forward towards the finish. Darius must have briefed the announcer without his knowledge, because suddenly his name was called out. Finishing in 1 hour 58 minutes, Michael Bates, number 4,922. Came the announcement. Let's have a big hand for Michael, who is a brain injury survivor and Windy City son, born and raised. The crowd took notice, and Darius reached over and lifted Michael's hand with his own in acknowledgement of the crowd's applause. Behind the finish line, Mandy had tears in her eyes as she saw Michael's moment of triumph. But before she could get even close to him, he was swamped by well-wishers, many of whom were injury survivors themselves. Some sported prosthetics, mainly from below the knee. There was even a double amputee who had completed the 3-mile fun run. She watched Michael get carried off in a wave of camaraderie from fellow runners and survivors. There was a cold bottle of water thrust into his hand. He was about to say no when Darius pointed out that it was non-alcoholic, so why not? She considered joining the celebrations, but already she could see that she would be an outsider, and as far as Michael was concerned, not a very welcome one. She turned sadly and drove herself home, reconsidering her options. The new Michael had placed her on a pedestal, but now he obviously viewed her as his fallen idol. A false god. He probably thought that she had broken his heart. She wiped away her tears and focused on not driving into the car in front of her. What about her heart? What would it take for him to see how much her heart was broken? Chapter 4, Chasing Shadows. Michael slept out Sunday, only coming home on Monday morning. By the time he got there, Mandy had already left, which suited him fine, as he still wasn't ready for the confrontation to come, but his mind was made up and firm. After a quick morning routine, he started the process of declaring his independence, even if only to himself first. His SUV, the same one from the attempted carjacking, was in the garage undriven in nearly 2 years, so he called AA to come get it started. Strewn haphazardly inside the car were a number of work papers, mostly relating to the hexalidomide clinical trials. He considered that they must have spilled from his laptop bag, which he supposed had been taken during the carjacking. He sighed as he considered the papers sadly. So much of his life had been spent preparing the trial protocols and liaising with oncologists across the globe to enroll patients to the clinical trials, and now the trials were almost at an end. The submission team headed up by Mandy had taken over, and were about to bring the 5-year process to its logical conclusion. He grabbed the papers and flicked idly through the reams as he prepared to discard them when he noticed that someone had highlighted a number of tables. He was tempted to ignore them, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he sat down. The highlighted table listed side effects and adverse reactions by comparative drug. The list included headaches, dizziness, loss of appetite, and the other typical effects which had predictably high numbers of reported cases. Around the middle of the table were entries designated as C. California, and the numbers were relatively high, showing up as 22%, and most were ascribed to hexalutamine. The entry was heavily circled by a neon orange highlighter. A handwritten annotation in what he thought he recognized as his own handwriting directed him to page 64. He flipped through to find another table showing deaths that had occurred during the trial. The number stood at 20%. That wasn't entirely unusual. In long-term cancer trials, one expected to lose patients, but the number seemed higher than expected. The trial in question was the Nigerian trial. Flicking through more papers, he found that the USA trial also showed a high number of events listed as C. California and a high number of deaths listed under other. This was highlighted also. To paraphrase Shakespeare, something was rotten in the state of Denmark, but what? He went to the home computer and tried unsuccessfully to log into the company mainframe. He tried variations of the last password he remembered, but none of them worked. He tried Plan B, as he had watched Mandy log in on a few occasions since his return, and he guessed at her password and got it right the second time around. He then spent most of the morning going through the clinical trials ready for publication. Most were precisely what he expected. Hexalutamine was performing ahead of the 2 comparative drugs and was showing better survival rates at 12, 18, 24, and 48 months. He chased up the 2 trials in question. He found them in their final iteration ready for submission. The results were identical to what he was holding, except CE/CEA adverse events had been attributed to one of the older comparative treatments and not to hexalutamine. It looked like the results had been altered. He tried to get into the files that held the raw data, but was denied access with a flashing warning that said not authorized. He pondered for a few minutes and eventually decided that to hell with doctor's orders and went to find himself a drink. He found it in the liquor cabinet in the form of an 18-year-old Glenfiddich single malt. He poured himself a shot over ice and sat down to consider the implications. CE/CA was not a typical notation for adverse events in oncology trials, and although his guess was that the C probably stood for cardiac, he may have been wrong. He thumped his forehead with the palm of his hand, but nothing. He wished his brain worked better, but it was what it was. He decided it could wait till Mandy got home. When she did, it was obvious even to him that she was walking on eggshells. He called out to her, and she came into the study, looking both nervous and stooped like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. "Can you help me with this?" She looked at him cautiously. "I just want to know what the C. California entries were under the reported side effects and adverse events on the hexalutamine trials is this what you want to talk to me about?" Her voice was filled with surprise and a level of distrust, like someone who expects a practical joke or the rug to be swept from under their feet. "Yes, I. Okay, CE was cardiac events. Mostly cardiomyopathy in California was cardiac arrest." She frowned. "Why do you ask?" "Okay then. The entries were what he thought they were, so most of the cardiac arrests resulted in death." He stated. It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't understand where he was going with this, but it also piqued her professional curiosity. "Why do you ask, and which study are you looking at?" She was frowning, trying to remember the details of the many trials, while he looked at her wondering how much he could trust her. He was vacillating now that she had been unmasked as dishonest and deceitful in her private life. He wondered if she would be different in her professional life. He was still grappling with his dilemma when she leaned over him, swiveling the printouts with their highlighted tables to get a better look, making his concerns irrelevant. No, this can't be right." She flipped pages and looked at what he had noticed. "No, this is wrong." She racked her brain. In the final studies ready for submission, almost all the CE and California events were attributed to one of the older drugs, fluorouracil, commonly called 5-FU. Here they were mostly attributed to hexylatamine. She looked at the bottom of the printed pages and noticed the descriptor V01. These were the initial study papers before they were reviewed and edited. Look at this. He showed her the same trials on the screen. They were designated V04. The CE/California results were now listed under 5-FU and not hexylatamine. It didn't take a genius to figure out that there was a problem either in the original or the later versions of the trials. The implications were either that a simple mistake had been corrected or that the data had been manipulated so that the cardiac arrests and resultant deaths were now shown under 5-FU. Mandy really wanted to dismiss it as a corrected mistake. After all, the trials had been reviewed internally and externally. A second part of her, the professional perfectionist, wanted to be sure. We need the raw data to confirm. She looked at Michael with a renewed appreciation of his mental capabilities. Even after the brain trauma from getting shot in the head, he had instantly recognized a problem that most would have probably skipped over. She also knew that if nothing else, she needed to see this through with him. She owed him at least that much. The raw data can only be accessed internally. She motioned to him. Let's go. They drove off in her Honda discussing possible reasons for the switch. 5-FU is known for its cardiotoxicity and sudden death. She challenged him on the drive. Yes, but its cardiotoxic effects are well documented and patients are switched off it quickly when it presents these days. He frowned. She looked sideways at him. He was like the Michael of old. He had a problem, and he would not let go till he found the solution. Have you noticed that the European, Japanese, and Chinese trials were hardly showing any cardiac events? He frowned a little harder. Only the Nigerian and the North American trials. Once in her office, she logged into the mainframe. They worked diligently for a time pulling raw data, and eventually they sat back and looked at each other. The conclusion was obvious. Hexylatamine presented acute cardiotoxicity resulting in sudden death in over 30% of African patients, which was why it hardly showed up in the European trials and was almost completely absent from the Chinese and Japanese trials. To a lay person, interpopulation variances would sound like discrimination, but the medical profession and pharma industry knew that not all drugs had similar effects or side effects between patients from different ethnic groups. Worst of all, it was also obvious that someone had manipulated the data to attribute the C-California effects under the older drug, 5-FU. It was medical deceit of the worst sort. It was worse than the thalidomide crisis of the 50s. At least in that instance, the Swiss company Ciba hadn't undertaken tests to determine birth defects, as it was hardly done in the 1950s, but it had resulted in causing severe defects in many babies born at that time. As bad as that was, at least that was a mistake. This is worse than bad, whispered Mandy. This is a deliberate manipulation of the data. They looked at each other shaken. It's cynical, confirmed Michael. Neither was certain what steps they would or should take that evening, but they both knew that this was significant. The consequences were enormous. The only question that remained was how many people were involved either directly or indirectly in the scientific fraud. They downloaded the data and it took almost half an hour before they walked back to her car with everything saved on a thumb drive that Michael put it into his pocket. The conversation on their way home was awkward, with both starting a sentence and stopping without finishing it or talking in technical terms. The implications would probably destroy the company. Furthermore, the oncologists running the US and Nigerian trials had to have been involved, so it meant that global reputations would be ruined. They looked at each other sadly. It was obvious to both that there would be no positive outcome for the two of them either. If they went public, they would both face severe backlash. Well, first there would be the praise and acclaim for their whistleblowing, but in reality, no pharmaceutical company would ever hire them again, and they would always be viewed with some level of suspicion. By the time they were back home, Michael was exhausted. Between all the mental stimulation, the late hour, and the whiskey, he had curled up and half slept in the passenger seat. Mandy wasn't about to leave him in the car, though, and she half supported, half carried him inside and placed him on the couch. She went upstairs to find him a pillow, hearing some noises from downstairs. She came back down with the pillow and a light blanket, only to discover two men waiting for her. Michael was lying on the floor completely unconscious and bound with cable ties. She tried to run towards her phone, but one of the men caught up to her before she made it and pulled her back. She spun around and scratched his face, but he wasn't deterred. He backhanded her hard, causing her lip to split and making her feel like she had been hit by a car. He grabbed her by the hair and punched her twice in the stomach, causing her to drop to the floor in pain as she struggled to catch her breath. They securely tied her up as well, then started searching the house in a methodical and practiced manner. They took everything from the home office, including laptops, USB drives, and all the paperwork they could find, regardless of what it was. They took her bag and their phones, credit cards, and even some of their clothes, packing them into travel bags. The word that popped into Mandy's head was professional. It was past 1 in the morning when they were satisfied. They took their time putting the house back together neatly. With a sinking feeling, Mandy realized that the missing clothes, money, and documents would make it look like they had simply run away. Before the thought had fully formed in her mind, they injected something into her, and she immediately felt drowsy. She was vaguely aware that they threw both Michael and her into the trunk of her Honda and drove off. A second car joined the Honda in a procession a little way down the street, although neither Michael nor Mandy knew anything about it. Chapter 5: Descent into Darkness. Michael woke up when a bucket of water was thrown over him. His wrists and ankles were tied to a chair in a dark room. Mandy was in a similar position next to him. They were in a windowless room that resembled a basement, with a bright light shining in their eyes, making him blink. Then the questions started. They didn't bother asking if they had spoken to anybody because they checked their phones and saw that no calls had been made. The only question that remained was, where was the USB drive? It was clear that despite searching the car and the house, they had found the early printouts but not the USB drive. No thumb drive. He lied. The slightly bigger of the two men ignored Michael while he wheeled a rickety office chair, squealing across the floor to Mandy, bringing them eye to eye. "Mrs. Bates, let me explain something to you." He spoke in a terrifyingly open and honest manner. "We will hurt your husband, bit by bit, until you tell us everything we want to know." He nodded gravely and held her eyes without blinking, almost daring her to look away so he could initiate the pain he proffered. "The only way you can help him is to tell us what we want." He didn't smile, and he didn't give her the impression that he enjoyed any of this. He looked and behaved like he was at work, about to fix an engine or hold a meeting. "Don't tell them anything," gasped Michael. "We're done already. They can't afford to let us live. Not after this." If the man was angry or put off, he made no acknowledgement. "Your husband was badly injured, and he is now better thanks to you, correct?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Talk now, Mrs. Bates, or watch us slowly but surely put him back where he was a year ago." He leaned in slightly. Not enough to make her pull back, but enough to force her to focus on him. "Where is the thumb drive, Mrs. Bates?" She shook her head. Her mouth was dry and she couldn't talk. I don't know," she managed. "They're going to kill us." Mandy Michael's voice rang loud and true. "They're going to kill us regardless." The man she had begun calling number 1 in her head paid Michael no heed. He didn't even deign to look at him. His eyes held hers in thrall and bore into her skull. "I'm going to ask again, Mrs. Bates. Where is the thumb drive?" She thought furiously. There were billions at stake if hexylamine was launched, equating to massive profits. If it wasn't launched, then the huge expenditure, which had already reached almost €1 billion, would be lost. Moreover, hexylamine was hailed as a primary treatment for lung and colorectal cancers, which were seen predominantly in black populations at a rate of 3 to 1 compared to all other population groups, and this was the group with the highest cardiac side effects. Hexylamine was most toxic to the patients it would be treating the most. Michael was undoubtedly right, they would kill them. One noticed the flash of realization cross her face and misinterpreted it. "Tell us now, Mrs. Bates." She started by shaking her head, but already number 2, the one she referred to as scratched, walked up to Michael and brutally pressed a stun stick to his chest. A gasp escaped Michael's lips as electricity coursed through him, making him arch. It switched off after a long while and Michael collapsed. It sounded like he was coughing when she realized he was laughing. "Is that all you've got?" He taunted them. 2 wasn't as tightly controlled as 1, and he attacked him again, this time for a much longer time. When he finished, it was obvious that Michael had wet himself and had bitten his inner cheek or tongue, judging from the blood dripping out his mouth. He laughed once more, this time sounding a bit demented. "You've got nothing," he scoffed, and then the electricity had him in its hold once more. This time, instead of collapsing after the current was switched off, he remained arched and then went into a series of spasms that were unending. His eyes rolled back into his head, and a low keening sound came out of his throat, and then he started vomiting. "He's having a seizure," screamed Mandy, unable to help him in any way. Help him, help him." Michael's seizure was unending. It went on and on while she screamed and cried. Their captors were momentarily unsure of how to react. One quickly realized they had miscalculated. The man most likely knew where the thumb drive was and had goaded them, hoping for a quick death. He had understood that there was no way out for him and the woman. One now faced the challenge of getting him back to normal so he could extract the information they needed. After all, they were professionals. "Where's his medication?" he asked the woman. "I don't know." She almost shrieked. It was next to his bedside table. "Let me help him. Let me help him. He could die." He considered her request for a moment. "Cut him loose," she begged. "He'll drown in his own vomit." "Okay, help him." He relented as he cut her loose, over the objections of his partner. At her instructions, they cut Michael from the chair and laid him on his side. Kneeling next to him, she opened his mouth and checked his airway to clear it. He had bitten his tongue and cheek, and his mouth was full of blood and vomit. He was unconscious but breathing normally. It will take some time before he's awake, she told them. They weren't happy, especially the second man, but she convinced them he needed his epilepsy pills. They cable-tied her wrists and ankles back to the chair, and cable-tied Michael's wrists even while he lay on the floor as an added precaution. Then they both left the room, and she heard them talking to a third person on the other side, and then footsteps going upstairs. Someone had gone to find Michael's medication. The bright lamp they had shone in their eyes earlier was off, and she sat with only dim light spilling in through the ancient cracked and damaged door to illuminate Michael's prone shape on the floor as she considered their plight. It was obvious that someone in the company had monitored their activities and had decided that the risk they posed had to be eliminated. Her mind led her to one possible person, and that was Robert. Oh, God. Please let it not be Robert, she prayed. Not the man she had trusted with so much for so long, but it was. He walked through the rickety wooden door, separating their prison from the rest of the building, silhouetted by the backlight, but she knew it was him. "Hello, Mandy." His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. The kind of voice that belonged to the night, after too much soda and too many snacks, yet with a promise of fun still to come. "You jerk." She spat her fear and anger like venom, but he stood unaffected by her verbal onslaught. "Michael's almost dead." She didn't know why she said that. Clearly, they would both be killed once the thumb drive had been recovered. Perhaps she was appealing to Robert's friendship with Michael, or maybe she was appealing to what they had once shared. He walked up and squatted in front of her, running his fingers caressingly over her cheek. "Michael will die." His intonation was flat and final. "But you can live, Mandy. Promise me that you will be mine, and I'll save you. Do you have no pity, no remorse?" She wailed, hoping to find a chink in his hard facade. "You're prepared to hurt people you know and claim to care about." He looked at her, unmoved by her words and unrelenting in his resolve. "It's not me, Mandy. Well, not just me. This comes from the top. I'm at the bottom of this food chain." He tried to caress her face again, even though she violently shook her head from side to side to avoid him. "Money before lives." She spat out bitterly. "And Michael and I are what?" Her voice trembled with fear and indignation. "Collateral damage to your financial gain." By now, her emotions overwhelmed her, and she was crying from fear and anger. "I can save you, Mandy, I can." He was so close that she could see his face, even in the light that shone from behind him, leaving him mostly in shadow. His expression was hopeful, yet there was an undercurrent of something else. He's not sure, she realized. He wants to save me, but knows that it might not be possible. "Remember the plans we made before?" That was before Michael was hurt, she said with finality. Number 2, the scratched and cruel one, as she thought of him, walked in insolently. "She ain't gonna talk." He grinned in anticipation. "But I'll have my fun with her before I harm her husband." He gave Robert a sideways glance. And no mistakes this time. "Nuu." It escaped from Mandy's mouth in a horrified wail as the reality of Michael's car jacking and head wound hit her. "What did you do?" "Robert, what did you do?" "I did what had to be done to protect the company. All those jobs." Michael wasn't as smart as he thought he was and left his electronic fingerprints all over. "Stop indulging," the jerk snarled too. He already had plans for her. Robert turned to give Tu a piece of his mind, but it wasn't to be. He found himself on the end of a hard fingertip tapping on his chest. "You're not in charge here." The smug grin directed at him was underscored with a reptilian stare. Number 2 relished putting the obnoxious rich guy in his place. Orders from above were to take care of anyone who posed a threat, and Noman wasn't necessarily immune. Robert didn't know that and wasn't taking kindly to the finger tapping his chest. He grabbed it and bent it back painfully. "Don't mess with me, little man." He snarled and backhanded him across the face. Number 2 spat blood and grabbed the knife they had used to cut the man and woman loose earlier. "Nobody hits me." He waved the knife around and lunged at the surprised and flat-footed Robert, who danced away looking for a weapon. "Back down, little man." Robert spoke in a commanding tone, but his worry was evident. "Our orders from the top are to eliminate you if you become a problem," laughed 2 with contempt. "And right now you look like a problem." He lunged again, and Mandy screamed in fear. Even the night's prior events hadn't quite prepared her for the unleashed violence she was witnessing, with Robert's life on the line. Compared to the raw confrontation in front of her, the previous few hours had appeared almost dreamlike and unreal. "Look closely," snarled 2. "After I'm done with your boyfriend here, I will harm you, and you'll do anything possible for me to spare your life." He lunged once again, and Robert, trying to jump backward, tripped on some broken furniture and his arms flailed to keep his balance. 2 took the opportunity and stabbed hard. The blade sank into Robert's stomach, and he cried out and fell on his back. The knife stayed stuck in Robert's body. There was no blood yet that would come as soon as the blade was pulled out. 2 bent down to retrieve the knife for a second strike when the unexpected fury that was Michael landed with the overwhelming power of a man with everything to lose and just one chance to save himself. No one had noticed that Michaels was awake from the time Robert arrived. Then, with little warning, the 2 men were locked in their duel of death. Mandy's eyes were glued on the unfolding violence, and he was all but forgotten lying in a fetal position on the filthy floor. Michael assessed the situation based on what he had heard and what he saw before him. He had recognized Robert from the moment he had started talking to Mandy. "Do not miss the chance," sang his inner voice, and he knew he had to act. Time slowed down to a crawl. All extraneous thought disappeared, and his focus narrowed like a predator going for the kill. He pulled the 2 interlocked cable ties on his wrists as tight as he could with his teeth and standing up raised his hands above his head and then jerked both down and across his waist as hard as he could like he had seen in a YouTube video and felt the plastic snap. He leaped forward praying that his legs would hold and grabbed the stun stick from the table. 2 heard the crackle but surprised and confused as to the implications opted to try pull the knife before turning to face the danger coming for him. He wasn't fast enough. Michael's fury would not be denied, and with a viciousness he didn't know he had, jammed the stick to the back of 2's head. The current buckled 2 off his feet, and he fell down twitching at the current coursing through his head. He lost control of his bladder and his bowels simultaneously as Michael mercilessly kept the button depressed and held it to his head. He wasn't sure how long it was, but eventually he became aware that the batteries were running out until with a final crackle it stopped. He stepped carefully around him to Robert, who was looking at him pleadingly. He gave him a grim smile that promised more pain and possibly death and kicked him in the head with all his strength, knocking him out, and Michael patted him down till he found his phone. There was signal, and he dialed 911. At his feet, 2 was still. His brains were probably scrambled, and more importantly, he was out of the fight, but Michael was taking no chances, so finding the bag of cable ties, he double-cuffed his wrists and ankles. While he was doing that, he finally got through to the operator and explained their situation twice. He was almost immediately contacted by a mobile number to which he dropped a pin of their current location, and he was also told to leave the phone on. He placed the phone in a dark corner and pulled some rat-eaten cardboard boxes over it to keep it hidden, then went to cut Mandy loose. She in turn was looking at him with a mixture of relief and awe. She came free, just as they heard footsteps coming their way. 1 had searched through all that they had taken from the house. It took him some time, but he had gone through everything more than once, and eventually he found the small box of pills. He smiled grimly with some satisfaction that things were back on track as he started shoving everything he had pulled out back into the Honda when his eyes caught a glint on the floor between the passenger seat and the center console. He moved the seat and extracted a branded promotional pen. He started to throw it back when he realized that the top incorporated a built-in USB thumb drive. His smile became broader as he realized that he had most likely found the prize. He flipped it in the air and caught it with quiet elation as he finally started making his way back. As he neared, he noticed the dead quiet, and he frowned. Why was it so quiet? His instincts warned him that something was amiss. He erroneously attributed it to Robert. It was clear that he was in love with the woman and would try save her, but their orders were to ensure they had found and destroyed all the incriminating evidence and made the Bates disappear whilst arousing the least amount of suspicion. He trusted his instincts, which led him to consider Robert as the joker in the pack, but they had instructions to terminate him as well if necessary, but only if absolutely necessary. He pulled out his pistol and entered the room cautiously, only to be caught viciously by a chair leg across the face. He felt his nose crunch, but it wasn't his first rodeo, and he fought off the sudden pain and swung the gun around to Michael, who was looking surprised after his first strike had not put one down. Suddenly the woman was on him, scratching, biting, punching, kicking. She held onto his gun hand, pulling it away from her husband. One pulled the trigger, and the sound was muffled by the contact of the muzzle to her body. Her eyes went wide with disbelief, but she didn't let go. He fired again, and this time he saw pain and shock wash across her face, and her hold on his arm faltered. Michael snarled an inhuman sound and brought the chair leg down again, this time catching one with a sickening thud on the head. It left him stunned, but his self-preservation still made him twist loose from the woman and bring the gun up to Michael, but it was already too late. Michael's rage and fear lent him superhuman strength, and he brought the chair leg down on one's head once more, this time feeling the bone give. But he wasn't finished. He hit him over and over and over till one's head was a bloody pulp, hardly recognizable as human. He kicked away the pistol as he ran out of the adrenaline and collapsed next to Mandy. She was alive but going into shock. He cradled her and used his hands to put pressure on her wounds, but it wasn't enough, and her blood welled through his fingers and formed a dark pool on the floor around them. "I'm sorry, Michael," she whispered. He tried to hush her, but she wouldn't be denied. "I'm sorry I couldn't love you enough. I gave you everything I had." She struggled to breathe. "But you were leaving, Michael." Tears were running down her face. "You were bored with me or with someone else, and you wanted a divorce, and you broke my heart." She closed her eyes, and he feared she had died, but she hadn't, at least not yet. He was trying to understand what she had said, but it wasn't coming together in his mind. He tried to rearrange the words in his head without success. "You broke my heart, Michael." She was running out of strength. "I tried to fill the void you left in my heart with Robert, but he wasn't enough. Nothing could ever be enough." She turned her head with difficulty to see his face. "I have loved you with all I have, Michael." Her body sagged in his arms. "I wish I could have loved you more." He was left destitute by the absolute truth of her words. She wasn't the betrayer. He was. He had betrayed her, even if he didn't remember, but she did. His chest exploded with pain, and he found himself crying harder than he had ever done before. He leaned in and hugged her. They were cool and unresponsive, and he felt guilt and regret wash over him like a cold ocean wave, leaving him numb and floundering in his pain and begging her to hold on. When the cops finally arrived, they walked into a lake of blood. They found one first with his head caved in, his blood having run on the bare concrete floor, joining Mandy's, creating a sticky black pool in which a bereft Michael was singing to Mandy a half-remembered ballad from Don McLean. Chapter 6. A-grade Don Bruno Rossi was angry. How is it that the FBI and Interpol get to take over the investigation and are hogging all the glory when it was CPD that started the original investigation, were first responders and made all the arrests? Cold coffee splashed out of a ceramic mug onto the wooden conference table as he slammed down his hand. State Attorney Kim Fox held up her hand to try to slow down his rant, but Rossi was having none of it. "We have 2 kidnapped victims who were tortured in the CPD jurisdiction. An attempted murder from last year in Chicago by the same people." He stopped to catch his breath. "There's a woman in the hospital. 2 suspects injured, 1 badly, and a 3rd suspect dead." He glared around the room. "To say nothing of a criminal case against an international drug company. We have a mountain of evidence, including testimony from the Bates, and it looks like Robert Newman's lawyer is trying to make a deal. So how did we get cut right out?" Rossi's captain, the commissioner, and the Cook County State Attorney, Kim Fox, with no less than 4 of her ADs in the meeting, had heard it all before, and as much as she'd have loved to hold on to the case, it had all the makings of a federal and international investigation. The Department of Justice had already informed them that they had a stake in the case, and even the White House had taken an interest. The Foreign Affairs Committee had been briefed, and the Swiss ambassador had been called in for a consultation. Rossi looked despairingly at the representatives from the FDA and the FCSC. This was big, bigger than anything they had expected, and the fallout would cross international boundaries, not to mention the global consumer's reaction, who were already skeptical about big pharma companies and what they perceived as excessive profit-taking. They were about to be outraged over this latest scandal. I think Congress is about to be bombarded with requests that all pharmaceutical companies are investigated, again. Fox sighed half bitterly herself, knowing that international pharmaceutical companies were experts at muddying the water and hiding their actual profits through complex structures that often required a team of auditors a long time to uncover, even as they manipulated political will until every investigation fizzled out. Well, Mrs. Bates made it, mused Fox. So at least that's a positive. And it was the husband who stopped the one kidnapper. What was his name again? The husband or the kidnapper? The kidnapper, Detective Rossi. I know the husband's name. That was Jerome Wilson. Almost completely unknown, except crimes committed when he was a teenager. Those files have been sealed, but we're waiting for your office to supply a petition to the court that they get unsealed. He was bitter. The defining case of his career was slipping away. Everyone except the feds were sympathetic to his bitterness, but it made little difference, and already talk had switched to contemplate the Swiss side of the investigation. Over 15 people from BioVest had been detained either in Switzerland or France, said the FBI Chicago office SAEC. Things are moving fast, and law enforcement agencies in Europe and here are wanting to bring the cases to court as fast as possible. Justice delayed is justice denied. Nodded Fox. Yes, and messed over is messed over, muttered Rossi. Regardless of who does the messing. Mess, thought Michael on the other side of the loop while drinking coffee in the hospital canteen with Darius. I've messed up my marriage and myself, and worst of all, I can't even remember it. It's visiting time already, frowned Darius. Why you still here, man? He nodded his head towards the elevators to the wards above. I'm not sure if I can, sighed Michael. Every time I see Mandy, I remember what she said to me, even if I don't remember what I did. I don't know how to be with her. I keep trying to discuss it, but she won't. His eyes clouded over. She says it doesn't matter. But it does. You're overthinking it. No, I'm not. Every time I see Mandy, I feel like a fraud. So you're hiding? That isn't the Michael I know. Darius tried to inject some positivity into him that would snap him out of his rut, but for the first time he accepted that he wasn't getting through. Because Michael wasn't in a rut. It was worse than that. He felt like there were 3 different people inhabiting the same body. One was the old Michael, clever, strong, and capable. He remembered how his family, friends, and colleagues would look up to him and hang on his every word. Words that he now had difficulty finding on the fly. Back then, they had come easily. Now he had to stop and think about what he wanted to say. He thought of that Michael as a faded photograph, a ghost lurking in the corners and stairways of his mind, and sometimes looking back at him from mirrors with pity. The second Michael was a stranger. No, not a stranger, or a someone or something malignant and hidden, like a dangerous person or a tumor. It was the man who had asked for a divorce and had hurt Mandy to the point where she had nothing left and she ended up with Robert. He couldn't find that Michael. He knew he was there somewhere. But it was like looking at a sealed vault with no way in, yet knowing it contained a secret he needed to uncover. The third Michael was slow and clumsy and had none of the first Michael's charm or charisma. He thought of himself as reheated leftovers from a gourmet meal. The only part of the new man he now was that didn't sadden him was his ability to engage in violence. If anything, he held on to the satisfaction of the pain he had inflicted, and yes, even the killing. He smiled grimly, reminding himself that it had to be done. Like putting down a rabid dog. He stood up wearily. See you later, Darius, maybe for a run. They agreed to call, and he went to see Mandy. She was sitting up in bed, cross-legged, wearing pajamas, surrounded by printed statements, affidavits, and legal documents awaiting her perusal and signature. She had lost weight and her eyes looked tired, but he thought that she was looking good compared to a couple of weeks before. Medically, she was getting better, having undergone surgery for her injuries. She was still tender and had a tube attached to her side for drainage. She jokingly told him that she'd never be able to wear a bikini again with the scars on her torso, but in truth, she had never worn one before either. The fact that she was recovering was also obvious in that she was getting bored with her hospital stay and was starting to complain about the food and the quality of the mattress on the bed. When he walked in, she was on the phone to Jason, who had come and stayed as long as he could, then finally, with great reluctance, had left, returning to his job. He had spent a lot of time together with Michael. On his last night, they had gone out for a meal and had spoken late into the night. They had drank non-alcoholic beverages, and Michael had quickly become emotional and confessed much of what had happened between him and his mother. It was a difficult conversation all round. Even adult children want to believe that their parents' marriage is perfect and untouchable, but he was understanding. "You're not helping yourself, Dad. If Mom says move on, then why can't you?" He reached across the table and grabbed Michael's hand. "There's no standing still, Dad. If you're waiting for inspiration, all you're doing is widening the gap between you. Even I can see that." Michael sat uncomfortably, wondering when his son had become a man and cursing his lost memories and missing time, even as Jason gave him one more try. In flight school, they teach you that regardless of what is happening around you, if you're in the pilot's seat, your job is to fly, to navigate and communicate. He fixed Michael with a hard but honest stare. "In other words, don't become frozen in inaction, Dad." Back at the moment, Michael was confronted by a rapidly improving Mandy and had to stop and ask himself why he was finding it so difficult to reconnect. Mandy noticed his sudden withdrawal and the way his lips tightened, and she lost her smile momentarily before forcing it back again. She understood him better than he understood himself, but she couldn't just tell him the problem because he might not accept it. He might consider it nothing more than empty words, or he might even become resentful that she was talking to him on an intellectual level. The problem in her estimation was that he had found out that she was involved with Robert, and that was real. The fact that he had served her with divorce papers and was either involved with another person or was about to was for Michael only a theoretical exercise, separate from his emotions because he couldn't remember it, so it wasn't real. It was the equivalent of hearing that something bad had happened to a stranger. She wondered if he could go back to loving her without first learning how to love and forgive himself. He, in turn, took her in, confused by the conflict he felt. He wanted to hold her. His perceived personal shortcomings left him struggling with his masculinity. He wondered for the umpteenth time what had prompted his desire to divorce her. Certainly, there had been no other person to claim they loved him or he loved them, or that they had made promises to each other, made plans, built a life together. Nothing. If it existed, it had disappeared like morning mist dissolved by the sun. They both pushed aside their thoughts to focus on the tasks ahead. They were surrounded by lawyers on all sides. There were depositions to complete, lawsuits against BioVest and Robert for damages, meetings with international law enforcement agencies and regulatory bodies, meetings with industry publications and medical associations. There were also ongoing requests from industry publications as well as international oncology associations to comment and at times to clarify previous comments. The professors and heads of department who had played a role in the fraud were cornered. Some fought back, but even they were quickly overwhelmed by the evidence against them. Reputations were ruined, jobs were lost, and those involved were not only removed from their positions but had their medical licenses revoked. Mainstream media gave Michael and Mandy their time in the spotlight by highlighting their role in whistleblowing, which was then followed by a storm on social media with both support and criticism. Certainly, there were enough people at BioVest who attacked them viciously, claiming that they were either wrong or had personal reasons to bring the company down. For Michael, it was overwhelming and spinning out of control, made worse since he had stopped his medication and his mental health condition was acting up, making him paranoid. It first manifested during his drive home from the hospital after a long day of depositions and meetings when he noticed a car following him home. He took random turns until the car was gone. The next night, another car followed him almost all the way home. He called Detective Rossi, who came by. They assigned a patrol car to his street, and Rossi personally followed him for the next few days, but there was nothing. As soon as the police protection ended, he was followed again. Mandy became concerned over his behavior, and eventually, she had a meeting with Rossi and Karina Anderson. They collectively reached the opinion that there was no one following Michael, who was probably experiencing a mental breakdown. With much discussion and a carefully gentle approach, Karina convinced Michael to book himself into a psychiatric hospital. Asked later, he openly admitted that he was suffering from a traumatic experience leading to anxiety, which in turn was leading to feelings of paranoia driving his fear. This was all brought about from both the night they were taken, tortured and almost killed, but also from his earlier brush with death and unexpected recovery. Karina Anderson told him that his mental problems had caught up with him. The only thing that surprised her was how long it had taken. His hospital stay had a number of benefits, not least was that he found himself protected from the chaos that he and Mandy had caused. He talked to her almost daily, even when she flew to Europe to testify. He testified live from his hospital via a video conference link-up. When she returned, she visited him as much as she could, but she was once again in and out of courtrooms, both testifying in criminal and civil cases. She was busy taking on the world while he considered himself to be doing nothing more than contemplating, yet he needed it and wanted that peaceful existence while his brain tried to catch up to his body. The resident psychiatrist in consultation with Karina Anderson considered that part of Michael's problem was that he had not stopped long enough to mourn his previous life. Then his new life was engulfed in a wave of violence. If that wasn't enough, it had transpired that even his self-perception of his previous life was wrong, and he was in a state of confusion. Yes, Michael, finally. Karina Anderson was working with him on his recovery. Say it again. I am who I am. I am what I am. Michael repeated his personal mantra. I forgive myself for the things I have knowingly or unknowingly done. A tear ran down his cheek. I deserve a happy life. I will work towards a happy life. Karina looked at him for a long moment. She had spoken to enough people since his awakening to understand who he had been before, but who he was now was no less interesting or attractive. Despite his own misgivings, viewed from the outside, Michael was quite impressive, she thought to herself. He had learned to walk, albeit with a slightly odd motion which was almost unnoticed, but it ensured that his lazy foot didn't drag. He wore an invisible hearing aid and his speech was almost clear except when he got excited and went into a cute stutter. More importantly, watching him stop to think over important questions made him seem sincere and likable. He was well-read and knowledgeable on many subjects, and although she understood that he wasn't quite as brilliant as before, he was still intelligent and his critical thinking was spot on. It's time. She smiled and pushed him out of the nest. Chapter 7 Second Life, Part 1. Mandy took a sip of her cappuccino. Her flight would be called soon to start her new life. She was leaving Chicago for good and starting off in the Bahamas to spend some time with Jason and Vera. That would be Jason's girlfriend, who was a marine biologist on the island. Mandy had spent the last week organizing the details of her, or was it their old life? The house had been sold fully furnished. She and Michael had both opened new accounts in their own names. The two accounts boasted almost $17 million each. That made them wealthy. Not rich. In her mind, rich was a different number altogether, but wealthy enough to enjoy the good things in life and never have to work another day unless they wanted to. And maybe she would. The FDA had approached her suggesting a position overseeing old and new drug applications carefully, but she had, at least for the time being, turned them down. It was almost 26 months since Michael had been shot. 2 months since the final court case had ended. She smiled with satisfaction thinking of the legal battle that had ensued. Robert had received life for his part in Michael's attempted murder, and another 50 years to run consecutively for his part in their kidnapping and torture. Number 2, as she had called him, was Kenneth Wilson. Turned out that number 1 and number 2 were cousins. Anyway, he had received 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole, and it looked like he wasn't fitting in well in the prison population, considering that he had already been stabbed on 2 occasions. Of the BioVest top executives, 4 had been extradited and stood trial in the U.S., and of the 4, 2 had received life without parole, and the other 2, 25 years each. The rest of the EXCO members, all 11 of them, had been tried in Europe and their sentencing hadn't been handed down yet, but it wouldn't be kind. She and Michael had jointly and severally sued Robert, and BioVest receiving a settlement from Robert of just over $6 million, leaving him with almost nothing, not that it would matter where he was going. The BioVest suit had paid out $45 million, $35 to Michael and $10 to her. They had sued for the equivalent of $100 million, but the judgment in European courts was typically less than a jury might have awarded in the U.S. The second financial hit to BioVest was the European Medical and Pharma Authority EMA's imposition of a €500 million fine, which left BioVest struggling once added to the expenditure on hexalitamine, whose applications for registration were withdrawn worldwide, and then the shark circled. Their lawyers had taken 20% of the award, totaling $10.2 million. She and Michael had opened an account with $7 million for Jason, and the rest they decided to split. Initially, she only wanted her portion, but Michael had not only insisted but had become stubborn until she gracefully agreed. They had agreed to donate the proceeds from the house sale to the University of Chicago Medical School and a further $500,000 to the Chicago Vets Association in tribute to Darius and the help he had given Michael over and above the job. Michael also transferred the deed of his SUV to Darius, much to the latter's embarrassment. Unfortunately, all the travel, court cases, legal work, and the associated stress meant that the relationship between Michael and Mandy was best described as distant, disconnected. She had tried to interest Michael in relocating to Fort Lauderdale and living on the canals. He said he'd love to, but not yet. He was on some sort of personal mission that both excluded her and kept him focused and secretive. She tried repeatedly to connect with him, but it seemed that the last 5 months had strained their relationship. Their shared traumatic experience and her subsequent recovery had initially brought them closer, but the months that followed had pushed them apart. Sadly, she had to admit that their relationship had become distant and fragile, leaving her at a loss on how to reconnect. Karina Anderson had advised her to give him space. "Let him come to you," she suggested. She called Michael just before she boarded. "Bye, Mike, I love you." Her voice suddenly broke as emotion swept over her unexpectedly. She thought she had run out of tears and felt drained of all her high emotion, but clearly not all. I love you too, Mandy, but there's something I have to do first." She could hear the worry, even fear in his voice. "Don't take too long. Please, Michael," she thought. "I can't lose you again. You've managed to get him back twice. There won't be a third time," said the irrational side of her brain. Michael, though, that the cooling autumn temperatures reflected the temperature of his heart and soul perfectly. His whole life felt cold and gray while his mind daydreamed, with images of Mandy in the Bahamas. He found himself envying her carefree freedom and all that sun, sea, and an escape from the fast pace of Chicago. But he wasn't ready to be free. Not yet. He started calling in favors until he got the telephone number of his previous personal assistant. "What do you want, Michael?" She didn't seem very friendly towards him. "I need your help, please, Georgia. I'd rather you just lose my number." She was about to hang up when he appealed to her one more time. "I'm sorry to impose on you, Georgia. Please give me 5 minutes. I promise to never call you again." "Okay, you've got 5 minutes time to get to the point." But he was having a hard time starting the conversation. Before I was shot and everything that followed?" "Yes, was I seeing someone?" There was a long silence. "Before I got shot and everything? Why, Michael, do you want to reconnect with your ex-lover?" Patricia Grant, known mostly as Trish to her friends and colleagues, spotted her reflection in the glass. All things considered, at 35 she looked good in her short-skirt business suit, with just enough heel to add some allure to her long and slender legs. Her position of senior brand manager at Boston Scientific meant that she transitioned smoothly out of the BioVest marketing department and into a cardiac specialist company with a long and successful track record in ICDs. She allowed herself a small satisfied smile at her fortunate escape from that debacle, but now it was time to find if BioVest and all that bad baggage was in her rear-view mirror, or if there was still a connection to her previous life. The ideal life. She walked into Gaslight Coffee Shop on Milwaukee Ave and spotted Michiel immediately. Surprisingly, her heart skipped several beats. He was thinner than before, and the intervening time had added gray to his hair, giving him a thick, attractive head of salt and pepper hair. She noticed an actual dent on the side of his forehead from the accident that had almost killed him. The same accident that had definitely ended their relationship. Or was it a fling? But that word had so many negative connotations. "Hello, Michael," she stood in front of him, and he glanced up startled. You're Trish," he exclaimed, standing up to greet her. It almost brought tears to her eyes as she realized that he hardly recognized her. To Michael, she seemed vaguely familiar. He dimly remembered meeting her at some time, but little else. "Please sit." He gestured her to a seat opposite him. They examined each other silently for a while. She ordered coffee and then ordered her thoughts into coherence. This was not going the way she had expected, or was she simply fooling herself and it wasn't going the way she had hoped? "I came to visit you," she held his eyes. When no one else was around, an unexpected tear ran down her face. "You don't remember me, do you?" "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I've lost so much." "And now you've lost me," she thought, and withered slightly inside. Seeing Michael in the flesh, up and about, reminded her of all he had meant to her and made a mockery of the short-lived relationships she'd indulged in over the past 2 years. They drank coffee and slowly, hesitantly, spoke more and more of their relationship. It started when they had been brought together at a company promotional function in New York. They were together again in Orlando a couple of months later. She had just divorced her husband and was feeling fragile. He was surprised that a younger woman was interested in him. They sealed the deal on a management trip to Ho in Switzerland and became romantically involved thereafter. He couldn't believe how open she was with him. She, in turn, appreciated his attentiveness and the way he made her feel special. They hadn't discussed her previous relationship or his marriage much, other than in passing. But they had learned enough. Her husband was too preoccupied with his hobbies and friends, leaving them as strangers merely cohabiting. Michael said that work schedules in his marriage had left him and Mandy passing each other like ships in the night. But moreover, he was bored even when they were together, worsened now that his son was out of the house. He had also admitted that Mandy was too conservative in her approach to life in general, but especially in the bedroom where routine was the flavor of the day. They spoke for a while longer, but it was one-sided with Trish trying to find any leftover connection to Michael while he searched his brain for any memory of their time together. They both came up with nothing. "There's nothing left for us, is there?" asked Trish, sometime into their second cup of coffee. "No." "I'm sorry," he frowned, feeling guilty yet relieved. "I just don't remember any of it. It feels like it all happened to someone else." Well, that's it, she admitted to herself. The end of a relationship. And it had been a beautiful relationship, full of excitement and promise. Now all she had left was a heart full of disappointment from a fire that was long dead, but at least it was closure of sorts. They hugged awkwardly. She left, and he finally felt his unknown past had been put to rest. Chapter 7, Second Life, Part 2. Michael was coming. Mandy did a dance. She considered making a quick call to Karina, whom she and Michael by now considered a personal friend, to reconfirm the strategy they had developed. But the call was probably redundant. The strategy was in play, and all that was really left was to work the execution. She had already been in the Bahamas for 9 days by the time Michael flew in to Grand Bahamas and then took a second flight to Georgetown. Mandy had booked him in at Hideaway's Inn, Palm Bay. But she was unavailable. A message informed him that she was out with Vera on a marine expedition and wasn't sure when she'd be back, but they might be out overnight or possibly a little longer. Her text said she was leaving him to his own devices for a while, but had recommended restaurants and some drinking holes for him to try. When he tried calling to clarify, all he got was "The subscriber you have dialed is not available at present." Nor were his messages going through. The chalet was 5-star luxury, but he was surprised to see no sign of Mandy inside the suite. He asked at reception, but it was booked in his name only. Strange, he thought, but then again she may have been living with Vera. He had arrived with a tiny carry-on bag consisting of almost nothing, so that first day he went shopping and returned with khakis, clam digger shorts, bathing trunks, shirts, t-shirts, canvas sneakers, leather loafers, underclothes, and everything else he could think of, as well as an expensive pair of retro Ray-Bans. That first night he started at the Flagler Room for some early cocktails, then meandered to the Exuma Yacht Club for an excellent meal of battered fried fish and chips. He stayed at the bar till about 10, but his condition forced him home soon after. The next day there was still no sign of Mandy. He spent the morning on the beach, going in and out of the water as often as the fancy took him. He met a number of fellow tourists at the resort. Most were family groups, but there were also some honeymooners and even a few older singles. Younger tourists were rare, as they clearly preferred or could only afford different or less expensive accommodation. That night started with sundowners and pre-dinner drinks at Doc's outdoor bar. He recognized a number of fellow tourists that he had met earlier, and he was invited over to join a small group that soon expanded into a big group. They all ended up at Eddie's Edgewater restaurant. He made friends, had fun, and left with the early crowd. On the third day on the island, he managed to catch Jason between flights, who confirmed that Mom was on the ocean with Vera and they'd be back whenever they got back. So he spent another day with new friends and had another night of lighthearted fun. Day 4 found him spending the day and early evening with his new crowd. Then they were back at Doc's outdoor bar. He had been recognized by one of the gang who proved to be a doctor. "You're the Michael Bates who blew the whistle on BioVest." Michael sheepishly agreed as he was patted on the back. "Well done, man, well done." Suddenly there was someone behind him. He turned around and took her in. She was wearing a short sundress and sandals. Her skin was sun-kissed. Her hair was cut in a new short style and highlighted, leaving her looking young and lively. Before he could say anything, she put out her hand and he stupidly shook it. "Hi, I'm Amanda." She looked at him intently. He stared into her eyes and recognized a hidden message. "I'm Michael." He held onto her hand for another few seconds. "My friends call me Mike. Will you buy me a drink, Mike?" They sipped on rum cocktails while he searched his head to understand what she was up to. He couldn't figure it out, but every time he started a conversation about them, she cut it off and asked innocuous and mundane questions, like how long he had been on the island, how he had spent his time, restaurants, meals, drinks, etc. She told him about her adventure on the water, chasing down juvenile manta rays to get a population count. Their drinks finished. She looked at the time and apologized that she had another engagement and disappeared. He went back to his chalet with a small takeaway supper. He called her, but once again there was no connection. He went to sleep somewhat shaken. The next day was spent in a fruitless search to find her. Neither Jason nor she were answering phones. He slept in the afternoon, then went out in the early evening. He hit docks, but she didn't make an appearance. He wondered about the well-known spots, nothing. Eventually, he had a burger and a beer and headed back. He was walking past the Flagler room when she stepped out. "Mike," she called out. "Mandy," he responded. "It's Manda." She corrected him. "Come join me and some friends for a drink." He spotted her group, made up of about 8 people, both men and women, some locals, some imports. For a moment, he was somewhat resentful and was about to decline but decided to join them to try to understand what game she was playing. The conversation was centered on local events until it turned to him. "What are you doing in the Bahamas, Mike?" He thought furiously for a moment, wondering if it was some kind of trap, but all he saw were open faces all around. "I've been in a difficult place for some time." He shrugged, realizing how detached he felt from events around him. Then a friend suggested a trip to the Bahamas to help decompress, so here I am. They nodded their understanding, smiling and offering suggestions on activities and trips he might be interested in. Before long, he started feeling the first tendrils of his mental shutdown, so he bid them all good night and beat a hasty retreat back to his accommodation. The next day, he wondered what Manda was up to over breakfast. Clearly, she was trying to recreate herself, but she was treating him like a near stranger. He wondered how or even if he fit into her new life. But then, why had she invited him over? Unless she had changed her mind between her arrival and his arrival. Instead of thinking about it too much, he decided to go book himself into a scuba diving course offered at the resort. He had always wanted to try it, but had never found the time. POTI stands for Put Another $1 in, laughed their young instructor as he handed out forms. "It's not as bad as the other option, Naui. That stands for Not Another Underwater Idiot." Then he introduced them to the equipment. Flippers were called fins. The air tank was called the dive cylinder. The part in your mouth that delivered air was the demand valve. The inflatable jacket over the wetsuit was the BCD, or buoyancy control device, and so on. A little later, they had to learn their dive tables and were offered their first bit of advice. You will be buddied up, which means you stay with your buddy at all times. Secondly, we will plan the dive and dive the plan. No exceptions. The last activity for the day was 10 minutes of treading water in the deep end of the resort pool. Then they were sent off with the training manual and promised a test the next day, followed by the first underwater exercise. He was walking towards the bar for a cold drink when he saw Manda sipping on what looked like a fancy juice cocktail with some of the women from the resort. He smiled and waved at the ladies and went up to the counter to order a non-alcoholic beverage, then joined the women who waved him over. "What have you been up to, Mike?" asked the tall blonde. She was generally the one who spoke the most. He was wearing his sunglasses and was sure his eyes were hidden as he gave Manda an appraising look. She had a neutral pose that gave nothing away. "Scuba diving lessons," he smiled and noticed a small twitch of interest. "It's going to keep me nice and busy for the next week or so. Two can play this game," he thought. There was some general talk around the subject, and then he turned to Sandy, who was playing backgammon at the bar counter. "Hey Sandy, I see the backgammon board. Do you play?" "Yes, I do, and if you're thinking of challenging me, you better bring your A game, because I've been known to play very well." She looked around for support from the others. "Let's play for points," then he laughed. 1 point per game. For those watching, 1 point per game didn't sound like much, but losing the game without getting a single piece off the board on a game that had gone up to the limit would equate to a big loss. It was unlikely, but that would be the worst losing margin possible, so not necessarily small change. They sat down to play. Most of the women, including Manda, stayed to watch. They chose their colors, and she won the roll. She led off and made a point. They played quickly and skillfully, making loud clacking sounds with the pieces on the board. In a short while, they were both in their home quarter and emptying the board. She beat him by a narrow margin, winning 1 point, and suggested playing the best out of 3. In the second game, he doubled the game before they even started, and she doubled it immediately back, so now they were playing for more points. His dice throws were low and bad, so he found his 2 furthest pieces stuck against her exit, but he slowly closed his home board with points. Finally, she had to leave a piece exposed after a roll of dice. He rolled a double and hit the straggler. He doubled the game again, and she accepted. He proceeded to win the game without her getting a single piece off the board. It was a big victory. The third and last game was a quick win for him once again. They shook hands and he held on for a moment. "Instead of the points you owe me, I'd consider us even if you can convince Manda to go on a date with me tonight." He gave her a grin. Sandy turned to Manda. "What do you say? Are you prepared to save me from this competitive player?" "I'll do it." Manda gave the crowd a selfless look. "I'll save you from this challenge." The crowd smiled in approval as Michael and Manda agreed to meet at a restaurant called Vibe later that evening. "Thank you for coming." He escorted her to their table. They ordered drinks in anticipation of a seafood dinner. "So, what shall we talk about?" She smiled across the table. He thought for a moment as they settled in. "Well, we're on an island, Sue, let's see. Okay, I have it. If you were stuck on a deserted island, what 3 things would you want with you?" She waited for her drink to be poured and took a sip. "I see you're putting me on the spot. Let me think." Her eyes sparkled mischievously. "First thing I'd want would be a friend." "I think you're already cheating." He laughed. "Secondly," she went on playfully, "I would want a portable speaker so we could listen to music and dance together." He raised his eyebrows. "Lastly, I would want a treasure map leading to a hidden stash of candy so we could have a sweet treat every day." Very imaginative, he conceded. "And what about food?" "Well, I guess we would have to find coconuts and fish to survive," she laughed. "And maybe some other tasty fruits." They toasted each other and continued to enjoy their meal. "Okay, now it's my turn," she sized him up. "If you wrote a message and put it in a bottle to throw out to sea, what would it say?" Other than the obvious "help me," he grinned. "Yes, obviously." She gave him a playful look. "If it was serious, I would write, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you do. The only thing that matters is finding someone to love." That's unexpected. Her eyes softened, but she held his gaze. Then the waiter arrived, and they placed their orders. The rest of the evening went well, and before they knew it, it was almost 10 o'clock. He paid the bill, and they said their goodbyes. She gave him a friendly hug before she got into a taxi, and he walked back to his room. The next day, he spent the whole day on the scuba diving course. The first dive was scheduled for the late afternoon. The group of trainees and their instructor went off the side of a boat and went down 45 feet together. They equalized their buoyancy by adjusting their jackets and floated weightlessly above the coral reef. Colorful fish swam past them, and they even saw a big potato grouper, which was friendly and used to divers feeding it. After the dive, they came up as a group and made a safety stop at 15 feet for 10 minutes. Then they got back on the boat, drank water to rehydrate, and felt tired. He took a cold shower as soon as he got back to his room and promptly fell asleep. The next morning, they had an early dive at 6 o'clock and a second dive at midday. They all went back to the resort tired. He woke up to his phone ringing. It was Manda. "Hey Mike, would you like to join me for dinner?" "My treat." "I would love to, but I might not be the best company tonight. I had 2 dives and they've exhausted me." She hesitated for a moment, then considering the attention he was getting from other people at the resort, she quickly replied, "Let's have an early dinner, and I'll make sure you get some rest afterwards." "So Manda, what's this promise to get me to rest?" He smirked. "Or was it just a slip of the tongue?" "Now who's teasing who?" She retorted. He looked at her and noticed how beautiful she looked with her sun-kissed skin and natural glow. Her short hair looked voluminous, and her eyes were bright and clear. She wore minimal makeup, allowing her natural beauty to shine. The sun, sea, and air had added life to her, and she was animated as she talked about her new experiences. One of the projects she had been involved in was helping baby green turtles hatch on a nearby island. She shared the excitement of witnessing the little turtles making their way to the water. In turn, he told her about the amazing variety of fish he had seen on his dives, including butterfly, trumpet, trunk, angels, and even the porcupine fish. He showed her the videos he had taken with his underwater camera, and she showed him pictures and videos from her phone. The end.